Thank you for coming. My name is Bill Waters. I'll be our MC for today. I want to welcome you to the Stanley Hank Marx Lecture in Dispute Resolution, a tradition here at Wayne State University. I'm taking on this new role as MC that has been handled by Laura Lee Keishley for 9 times, I think. So I'm new at this, so please I beg your patience. Laura Lee was the chair of our department, the interim chair of the Department of Communication for 3 years, and has now taken a sabbatical to recover. I'm pleased to do it. So I want to just mention, normally we've done this event on Conflict Resolution Day, which is in October, the 3rd Thursday in October. This year we decided to do it in conjunction with Cyber Week, Online Dispute Resolution Cyber Week. So we have people watching us from around the world, The Hague, Israel, Oklahoma, a lot of different places. I wanted to put a shout out to the mediators in Traverse City, Michigan. I know there's a group of 8 mediators watching from Traverse City, so thank you for joining us. But I wanted to note something that I think is significant. As a member of the Conflict Resolution Day National Planning Committee for many years, I noticed this year that the end of the federal budget government shutdown was negotiated on Conflict Resolution Day. So I'm wondering if we created the psychic space for that to happen. I'm going to take some credit for that. So somebody said, do you have another one planned for in February? So we'll see. So I wanted to, I wanted to invite the Association for Conflict Resolution as one of our partners. And we have a Michigan chapter, Southeast Michigan chapter, and I thought we should, John Turley is going to say a few words about the organization. It's a good professional development opportunity for our students, and it's a good opportunity to network with professionals already deeply engaged in the field. So John, come on up.
Thank you, Bill. I'm a mediator, a business consultant, and an evangelist for the ADR profession. And I'm here today because the Southeast Michigan chapter of the Association for Conflict Resolution, we're in the midst of a renaissance. And as part of a renaissance, we need more artists to practice the profession. And what I propose is that if our students will join us for the fee of $20, only $20 for the local chapter, or $80 for the national chapter, they'll be part of this renaissance. Mediation is an art, and we need to cultivate more artists, younger people, to take the torch of leadership and move forward. I say this because we need new members, and I've been told that the senior members are getting older. And I said, well, I guess that includes myself too, although I never looked at it that way. Part of the benefit is access to resources if you truly love and you have a passion for conflict resolution and mediation. The other thing I'm going to suggest is that that bridge between being a student and then deciding, well, it's a very worthy profession, but how do I put it into practice? I think that's where the ACR has to step forward and do more for the students to say, here are where the career opportunities are. And I think it's incumbent upon us as members of the ACR to help with that path. I think one of the ideas I've spoken with Professor Waters about has been building a mentor-mentee, mentor-team organization from the ACR. We have a lot of talent, a lot of distinguished people. You're going to hear from Zena shortly. But I think the key to taking that next step into the business world or into the legal profession, I think you need some help. And we have to offer that help. So in return for joining, part of my proposition is we need to do more, and we need to do more with Wayne State University, which I'm going to use as a model. You may not know this, Professor, but you're going to be my model. But the idea is this: we need to have a liaison between the schools, the businesses, and then people in the profession. I think that combination, that triangle, I think will work. At least I'm willing to put a lot of energy into it. And the other thought I have, I just reviewed a book for the ACR by Professor Rains from Kennesaw. She teaches ADR. And she brings out this whole idea that the skill set that's changing in this world is that you're not just a manager anymore. You're a manager/mediator. And she refers to secret mediators because people don't come right out and say, well, I'm going to handle this business problem through the skills of ADR and through mediation. They say, well, I'm going to use good scientific management skills. But the new leaders are going to use the artistic foundation of ADR combined with the scientific foundation of business practices. And I think this is where the new opportunity is. It's not easily defined, but I think with cooperation we can do that. So in closing, I would just like to encourage everyone to join us either on a local basis for $20 or on a national basis for $80, but we're here to help you. We need your help to build this organization and to have that nexus between the school, the ACR, and the next step, the career. So thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you, John. I love being a model. Our program is a model, and we're proud of it. I wanted to mention that if you're watching on the live stream, we're going to be using the hashtag #CyberWeek for conversations. I'm going to take a look at that in the question and answer period, and if you have questions you want to pose to our presenter, I'll keep an eye on the #CyberWeek hashtag on Twitter. So now I wanted to mention, some of you may be Tigers baseball fans, and we have an amazing pitcher, Max Scherzer, and he's not the only great thing that has come out of the University of Missouri-Columbia. My next speaker, Dr. Lee Wilkins, is our new chair of our Department of Communication, where the Masters of Arts in Dispute Resolution is located, and she's fresh from the University of Missouri-Columbia, and we're glad to have her on the mound. Lee Wilkins.
Thank you, Bill. I think that may be the first time in my life that anyone has ever referred to me using a sports metaphor. So anyway, it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you who are here and all of you who are out there in cyberspace to I believe it's the 10th annual Hank Marx Lecture in Dispute Resolution. Hank Marx, I think, is who most of us want to be when we grow up. As part of his interdisciplinary focus in dispute conflict resolution, he completed his work after he was 80, which to me means that not only did he combine intellect, but I think there was a little bit of wisdom and life experience there. He took courses in the Dispute Resolution Certificate Program, as I understand it, where he showed skill and kindness and great care in his assignments. In one class, Hank served as a mediator in a simulated negotiation of a 72-day armed standoff, where Mohawks were protesting the expansion of a golf course onto their native lands. He did a great job. He found peace where it seemed unlikely to exist in the run-up to the meeting. I think that that's kind of the spirit of this program, and at least as I have come to know it through Bill and through Laura Lee, it is an effort to find common space where people may begin to think that it doesn't normally exist. And having been department chair for all of 4 months, I can most certainly assure you that finding that common space is a really great skill. I'd also like to make one other announcement. It's really not an announcement. And I think many of the people here may know, but I'm not sure that everybody else does. Bill Waters has graciously agreed to take over the management, if you will, of the dispute resolution program. He has really big and special shoes to fill from Laura Lee Keishley, who did that work for, I think, about 15 years. So Laura Lee, I would like for you to stand up, please, so we can give you a round of applause for work well done. And also encouragement to come back to us after your sabbatical and fill us full of all sorts of new insights. Now I'm going to turn the microphone back over to Bill, who will introduce our speaker, Zena Zumeta, who holds a Juris Doctorate from Brand X. Brand X is the law school up the road in Ann Arbor. Again, thank you all very much. I'm so glad you're here.
Lee's, as usual, moving ahead quickly. I still want to mention a little bit about Hank. I had Hank Marx as a student in my Roots of Social Conflict class, which was where we did the standoff at Oka. And I remember the students, Hank had this way of, he was wearing a bow tie and he was smiling, and he would get to know everybody in the class really well. They felt like everybody thought he was their best friend. And then as the conflict heated up and they became polarized, they all still felt like they were friends with Hank. And so we had, the week that we were doing the simulation, we had two teams. So we had two separate groups with different sets of mediators. The group that wasn't Hank failed. They couldn't find any kind of solution, whereas Hank, it was magic. There was, the government was creating a cultural center, and the military was honoring the tradition of the warrior clan, and it was a great thing. So it's really, Hank had some magic, and I'm glad that this lecture is named for him. I want to invite Sue Marks to come up and just say a word or two. Sue's Hank's wife. She's no slouch. She's an Emmy and Academy Award-winning documentary filmmaker, and she has come to all of these events over the years. And the lecture series was created by Sue's family. Hank, when he turned 80 years old, they wanted to do something to honor him. So they created this lecture series, which has been really great for us. So Sue, would you like to say a word or welcome from the family? Come over this side.
Thank you, and thank you for being here, and thank you, all of you out in cyberspace, too. It's an honor. It's been an honor for 10 years to recall Hank and celebrate his wisdom. In his late years, he went back to school, as you were told, and he'd been going to Wayne. He probably had the largest transcript ever in this building. But he took every course he could and every subject he could find for semester after semester during the many years we were married, 53 to be exact. And he loved school, and finally he found out what he really wanted to be when he grew up, and he was already a little grown up at the time. But he walked across the stage proudly with many favors from Lorelei, who was his mentor and his support through all of this time. And Bill, you as well. So I want to thank the team here on behalf of Hank and my daughters, who started this for their dad's 80th birthday. And it is now 10 years later, and my husband died 6 years ago. So I am ever so grateful, and thank you all for all your support and your wonderful memories of a wonderful guy. Thank you.
I recommend you check out SueMarksFilms.com for lots of great documentary material. So now is my chance to introduce our speaker for this year. Now, there's no pressure on you, Zena. We've had the previous speakers have included senators, congressmen, Bernie Mayer, the famous author, directors of mediation centers. It's been a very distinguished group. Bob Ackerman, who's here, spoke about the relationship between law and non-law, like lawyers and non-lawyer dispute resolution people. So we're expecting you to kind of wrap it all up for us, bring it all together. Zena's a really good choice for this because she's been a mediator since 1981, so more than 30 years of practice to reflect on. I got to know her through a personal recommendation from my cousin Carol. My cousin was my oldest cousin, she was in Philadelphia, and she was my senior cousin. She was a Buddhist, and she had a boyfriend who was a jazz musician. She was very cool. And she heard I was moving to Michigan, and she said, "You really have to look up this awesome person, Zena Zumeta." So she comes with a personal recommendation from my coolest cousin. So that's good news as well. Zena started her career really in the labor relations as an advocate. I remember her being involved with the nurses' unions, and so she's kind of come through the whole spectrum. I hope you'll tell us some about that. Please welcome Zena Zumeta.
Oh, yeah, that's bad, isn't it? Blank, okay. So I am delighted to have been asked to do this. I was a little bit worried because of the Cyber Week part of it. The irony of my talking during Cyber Week is just so great. In case John Healy or Jim Malamed ever hears this, the struggle that they had with me in the 80s just to get me onto email for was ridiculous. And even now, what I'm able to do in this area is I can do Skype. There may not be anything else that I can do, and I struggle with Google Docs. So I do think that that's where we're going, and I think it's wonderful, and I'm not sure that I am the best person to be speaking during Cyber Week, but I'm delighted to be here. I do want to talk a little bit about the perspective that I have from many years of doing this, partially because the things that I thought I would be doing now when I started are so different from the landscape that we have over these years. So I did start out learning about mediation from my labor negotiation work. I negotiated for nurses, and part of what I learned there was from, of course, FMCS, that was doing the labor mediation while I was trying to help settle things. But I think for me, going into labor negotiations was to fight. That was really what I wanted to do. And I was good at it, and I enjoyed it, until I woke up one day and realized I enjoyed it, but what was it doing for my constituents? Where were they in all of this while I was enjoying myself? And looking at it that way, I started thinking, okay, what's in their best interests? What is it that we need to do? And of course, the answer to that you all know, which is settle. They needed to be able to do their jobs. They needed to be able to work in a good atmosphere. They needed really to have good relationships with management. And so from the point that I figured that out, I started trying to create a different atmosphere in the workplace to try to work with labor management teams, to try to help people resolve issues. And then I started thinking that wouldn't it be nice to do it from the middle instead of from either end? That maybe that would be more effective. I am not clear that that is the case, and I think that's why the landscape looking back now is so different from what I had thought when I entered the field. So when I had the thought, actually I was working for the Institute of Gerontology at the University of Michigan in advocacy and aging. And I was asked by the director of that organization if I would help resolve a dispute between two of the faculty members, which I did and thought it was great fun. And the woman that I did it with, my co-mediator, as it were, didn't like it so much. And I thought, well, I like it, and I seem to be good at it. Maybe this is, again, the route that I should pursue. So I went over to the law school and talked with the then Dean St. Antoine about it. And he's an arbitrator. And he said, no, arbitration is the thing. That's really what you should do, because that settles things. Mediation may or may not. And he actually, I think, said mediators are wishy-washy, whereas arbitrators are strong individuals. So my association with arbitration was that yes, it did settle things in the contract, but what it didn't settle was the underlying disputes. And so I had more interest in mediation because you could go underneath the contract. You didn't have to just look at the wording. And so what would happen in labor situations was that somebody would come to me as a labor representative. I would listen to the issue. I would look in the contract, see what language was there to work with, and then go forward with that language, come back with an answer on the language. Well, what happened to their dispute? Really, it wasn't that connected. So mediation made more sense to me. As I was walking out of the law school, I went to visit my family law professor, David Chambers, who was a friend, and he asked, "Why are you here?" And I told him. And he said these famous words for me, which were, "Are you aware that there is a movement to do mediation in family law?" Which I didn't know anything about, so no, I hadn't. And he got me together with someone, a social worker who was trying to start a family law practice. So that's really where it started. And I quit my job, held my nose and jumped, and decided to see whether this would work. 2 years later, I think I finally made enough money to pay my bills. But it was very exciting at the beginning to think through, okay, what is this that mediation is? Now, this was the early 80s. So what was going on in mediation in the early 80s? Not much, not much. In California, they were actually ordering custody mediation. Around the rest of the country, not much was going on. The Academy of Family Mediators, I think, had just started in the early 80s. SPIDER existed, the Society of Professionals in Dispute Resolution.
Started at Wayne State.
Did it really start at Wayne State? Wow. I had no idea. So there were national organizations, and actually that's how I got involved in the national organizations, because really that's all there was back then. In the state of Michigan, there just wasn't much going on with the three of us who were doing anything in the area. And so we all kind of joined the national organizations and got to know people there. And of course, I've been much enriched by all of that work with the national organizations. But looking at what was mediation back then and what we thought was mediation back then was kind of interesting. The big war that went on, and have we always had wars in dispute resolution? I think we have. The big war back then was around lawyers versus non-lawyers. And the bar associations around the country were saying lawyers should not be mediators, that it was unethical for lawyers to take on a neutral role, that lawyers really had to advocate. And so when I started teaching mediation, and it's embarrassing how little I had done when I started teaching, most of my classes were not lawyers. I would say a quarter or less in the classes were lawyers. And of course, by now that has totally turned on its head. So looking at what did lawyers bring to mediation? What did other people, real people, bring to mediation? What were we looking at in terms of what mediation ought to be? The radical thought was maybe people should sit down and talk to each other. And that was radical back then. So there was a lot of restorative justice that was going on back then. And really that was kind of the limits of what people were thinking was, okay, let's sit down and talk. Let's see what will happen if people actually are allowed to sit down and talk to each other. The courts really were not in favor of mediation, except in California. And nobody believed that California had any good ideas back then. Certainly we in the Midwest did not. And the courts took very seriously, particularly in the family law area, that the court knew better than the families, certainly, and better than anybody else what should happen to children in a divorce and even what should happen to the adults in a divorce. The civil courts felt the same way, that there was a judge there, the judge should make the decision. What was the point of farming it out to somebody else? And in fact, many of the judges really felt like it was an abrogation of duty for them to do that they had been elected or appointed, they were being paid to do this job, and they really should not send anything out to anybody else to be resolved. So what changed over the course of that time to the point that we are now, where mediation is kind of taken for granted? Arbitration certainly is part of the field. There are many, many other approaches. And how did that happen? What were the societal changes that we are looking at that made for those changes? Back in the 80s, mediation was really part of the consumer movement. And the consumer movement was to say that really we should be in charge of our own lives. We shouldn't have to rely on professionals, whether it be lawyers or judges or even doctors. We should be able to get our own information, rely on our own wisdom, make our own choices. And so to go to a judge, to go to a doctor, to go to a lawyer and be told what to do was somewhat offensive to the people in the consumer movement. Now, I would say the consumer movement was at least 2% of the population or less. So we're not talking about a lot of people, but it had a lot of influence, and there were a lot of articles being written. And so mediation became part of that, where people would voluntarily come into mediation and try to resolve it for themselves. It was part of their ethic. And of course, now, when I look back on the kinds of people who came in to mediation, they were people who were pretty well educated. They were people who really tried to be informed about their options and their decisions. They treated each other pretty well. And so the job of a mediator, as I look back on it now, was very easy. And the cases that I thought were difficult then, I can't even imagine. I mean, to me now, I think the difficult cases back then would be very easy. So again, there's been a big change in that, from people coming in voluntarily to people being ordered into mediation, or just assuming that that's the way that they should go. In the 90s, I was trying to think through one of the big changes in the 90s, and I think starting in the 90s, although I'm not positive, was that we started to institutionalize mediation. That is, we were looking at it as going into the courts, as going into the agencies, as going into organizations. I'm not sure when the federal government started hiring their own internal mediators. Was that in the 90s?
1990.
Yeah, so it was the early 90s they started doing it. And so mediation then became kind of a requirement, and it also became the norm in some areas. So what did that do to mediation? One of the people that I talked to in preparing for this talk started by saying, mediation right now is cookie cutter. And I started to think about, okay, what does that mean for mediation to be cookie cutter, and what is the difference between what we expected it to be and where we are now? So when I started mediation, there wasn't a vision of how long it should take, or how many hours it should be, or who even should be in the mediation. And so all of that had to be thought through and structured. Well, once it becomes institutionalized, then that becomes institutionalized as well. So the question, for example, of do lawyers come into the mediation, or is it just the parties? Each institution made its own rules. There were some court programs where lawyers were not allowed in the room. There were others where it was assumed they would always be there. For excuse me, for civil mediation, it was assumed that the lawyers would be there. And one of the things that happened in Michigan, actually I think it may have happened even in the 80s, was that Michigan mediation was known around the country because it was really evaluative mediation, late stage. The parties would almost present a case. It was really case evaluation to 3 mediators. And then those 3 mediators would come up with a recommendation back to the parties. So it wasn't until 2000, when the new law was passed, that in Michigan we gave up the idea that was mediation, and became a little bit more like the rest of the world in terms of facilitative mediation. So in Michigan there was mediation, which was this case evaluation, and then facilitation, which was more of what we think of as mediation, and hardly anybody did facilitation. Nobody really thought it was worth much. And I think for the same reasons as the dean said to me in terms of why arbitration should happen, evaluative mediation gives answers. It gets results. And so people valued that a lot more, and I think still do in many ways. What is the purpose of mediation? What are we there for? What is it that we're trying to accomplish? And that question, I think, still exists, that we're still looking at that question of what are we trying to accomplish? Where are we going? The institutionalization of mediation, I think, in the 90s really led to we want results, we want an outcome. Because it was helping the courts or helping an organization, it was helping settle cases through the EEOC. Whatever that organization was, they wanted it to settle cases. And so when the pressure turned on to settle, what happened was that mediators became a little bit more directive, or a lot more directive. It was in the 90s that we started talking about the nomenclature of, is everybody familiar with, evaluative, facilitative, transformative. And the transformative mediation movement, I think, came out of that change from let's sit down and talk to let's get results for the court. And so there came out of that this movement of really this is about relationships, and transformative mediation really is looking at relationships. So if we can find a way for people to relate better, to understand each other better, and for them to be able to speak better, speak their own mind, that's really the point from transformative mediation's point of view. So we've had those tensions from the 90s of, again, what is the purpose of mediation? What is it that we're trying to do? Where are we going? And are we there yet? When I look at what was happening in Florida, for example, Florida was probably, and still is, the most highly regulated state for mediators. And they were trying to define mediation and then set up a system where mediators were expected to get a certain amount of education and training, and to do and to set up a set of standards of practice that mediators were actually held accountable for what the practice was. And they weighed in that mediation should be facilitative. What's interesting is that in Florida, it's not. It really is evaluative. And I think part of the reason is because so much of mediation is court-ordered there, and they're looking for results. And the lawyers who are bringing the cases into mediation want those results, and so it has become very evaluative still. And yet, the system, the regulatory system, is saying, no, we want facilitative. So I think we're schizophrenic in that manner, that on the one hand, and I think Michigan also has gone that way, that our court rules really focus on facilitative mediation, although the family court rule does allow for evaluative mediation. I don't think the civil does, and yet most of the mediation that's going on is definitely evaluative. So there have been articles written on why is that so? Why are we looking at evaluative mediation? A number of the articles talk about the fact that it's the market that speaks. And as I look at the market, one of the questions that I have is, who is speaking? And I think it's the lawyers who are speaking and the courts that are speaking. If we asked the parties, I don't know what we would find out from them. And it's one of the things that I'm hoping that is going to be coming out of academia, is to find out from the parties, what do they actually want out of mediation? Part of the difficulty from my point of view in asking parties about mediation, have any of you ever tried to ask parties what they thought of mediation? It's frightening, actually. If you ask them the day after mediation, what did they think, or as they walk out, what did they think? What they'll tell you is what they thought of the result. If you ask them 6 months later, what did they think of the mediation, the answer is, did I go to mediation? Really? And if you ask them what did they think of the mediator, did I ever meet that person? Is that somebody that I knew? So it is really so much a part of the woodwork for them of their own drama and their own angst and whatever it is that they're going through, that what we do as mediators really does not affect them unless we do something really annoying to them or devastating. Otherwise, it's just part of the sequence of things that happened to them and whatever the litigation or the conflict was that they were a part of. So much as I would like to find out from the parties what they want out of the mediation, I wonder what we'll find out if we are able to get a sense from them of what they wanted. Most of process, you all know this, is invisible. And so while what we study in mediation is process, the parties don't have a clue what it is that we do. And so all they're looking at really is the outcome. So is it strange then that that's also true of the courts, that it's also true of the agencies, and that it's also true of the lawyers who come into the mediation? So here we are out in the wilderness trying to say that process is important. And who is it important to? If it's just us, does it matter? Or should we be paying attention to other things? It matters. Well, I would love to have a discussion of that, because as I look at the history of it, where I was in the 80s was, oh, it's so important. Process is so important. As the 90s came in and the institutionalization came in and the court rules, in the thousands, is that what we call it, the aughts? The changes that I was trying to see, I'm trying to think, the big change to me over the last 15 years is that mediation has become a business. That if it was a practice in the 90s, in the 80s it was more a movement. In the 90s, I think it became a practice. In the aughts, it became a business. And so we see that a lot of people are looking at how can I make a career of it, which is wonderful, but they're also looking at where's the money and what is it that I can do to get into part of that field where there's money. Many people believe that that part of the field is owned by retired judges, that they're the ones who are really able to make the money in the field, and that there may be paid positions in government or in organizations, but that otherwise they're not looking at people actually being able to make a good business of mediation. The models that are out there, jams and dispute, that kind of thing, really rely on retired judges to bring people in for the money. So Bernie Mayer, who spoke at one of these, and who is always way ahead of all of the rest of us, wrote a book called Beyond Neutrality. And that's one of the things that I begin to wonder about now as we're into the teens as opposed to the aughts, and looking at the landscape of what mediation is. There are two things that I think are really coming to the fore. One is academia, that dispute resolution is now, I think, fully ensconced into academia, which is quite wonderful. It means that people are looking at what is it and what makes a difference in it and what should we be doing. I myself have put my big toe, or maybe my little toe, into teaching at several law schools and teaching mediation and other dispute resolution processes. And I wonder, as I do, whether that's the way to go, whether that really is what we should be teaching and what people should be learning. I think Bernie Mayer really had an excellent point when he said that we should be conflict engagement specialists rather than mediators. How many people want a mediator? One of the areas that I practice in is elder mediation. And one of the difficulties with elder mediation is that it requires, this is usually with the children of the older person who are either fighting about the care of the older person or the money of the older person, or after death, the inheritances. And it's very difficult to get a whole family to a table. I don't know how many of you have ever tried to negotiate with your families about anything, but it is very difficult to get everyone to agree to come to the table. And so unless the court orders mediation in that area, it's highly unlikely that you're going to get everybody to come and sit down.
Technology.
Well, Well, no, they don't even want to do it through technology, because that certainly is available. It's that they don't want to talk to each other. And they certainly don't want to be in the same place with each other to do it. And it's not clear they want to settle the issues, more to the point. And so what I find myself doing more in that arena is conflict resolution coaching. So whoever it is that called me and is trying to resolve the issue with the families, they can be coached as to how to negotiate the issues, negotiate through the conflict with their families. Well, in law schools, when we teach mediation, and there are a number of law students who are really excited to learn it, will they ever, will they ever actually do it? Or are they more likely to be representing people in the process of mediation? And if that's the case, would we be better off teaching that? I certainly don't presume to talk about any of the non-legal programs in dispute resolution, but what is it that people coming out of those programs will actually be doing in dispute resolution? As you were talking in terms of management, it's management as mediator. It's anybody who's working in a committee on the job is learning to be a facilitator or a mediator. Maybe the skills that people need to learn are, as one of my most learned colleagues, Peggy Herman, says, maybe conflict competence is really what we're looking at rather than mediation. And maybe we've been on the wrong track looking at teaching mediation as the skill. Maybe it's conflict competence that needs to be taught as the skill, and then all the different ways that people can engage in conflict resolution and conflict competence along the way. So here I was back in the 80s looking at a career in this area, and I had truly been blessed to be able to have a career in this area. And then coming to the thought anyway, I don't know if it's a total conclusion, but at least the thought that maybe that isn't the way that we should have been going through all those years. Mediation certainly is something that needs to be offered. There's no question that it needs to be part of the toolbox that we're using. Not that many people are going to be able to practice it. And so where can they make their contribution to the field of dispute resolution? And how should we be approaching it differently? I know that Susan Butterwick, who was just up on the screen there, has been working with a judge in Washtenaw County to look at peacemaking circles and peacemaking courts, so that judge would like to refer cases to peacemaking circles. And from his point of view, the difference between that and mediation, and I find this so ironic, is that in peacemaking circles, people sit and actually talk to each other. Because he believes that in mediation, that doesn't happen. Well, what happened to mediation that it doesn't happen? And I agree with him. In most of mediation, it doesn't happen. So were we that far off in institutionalizing mediation? Or, I'm sorry? Throw out the cookie cutters, right. Well, if it's helpful, do we want to throw those out? What is the place of it? So I think that where I come out is here. Do we know what mediation is? Do we know what dispute resolution is? Do we know what makes it work or not? Do we know who should be doing it? Do we know who should be part of it? Should it be regulated? Is it much too legalistic anyway? And why do people want it? Why do people come to dispute resolution processes anyway? I'd like to conclude with using a story that is not mine. This is a story from Nina Meyerding. If any of you know who she is, a wonderful mediator and trainer now from the state of Washington, who told this story at one of the conferences that I attended. She said she got a call from a gentleman who said that he wanted a transformative mediator. And she said, well, I don't do transformative mediation. What is it that you're looking for? And he said, well, I have a sister who needs to be transformed. And she said, well, I don't think that that's really what transformative mediation does. Let me talk to you a little bit about what it is and what it does. And so she talked for a long time with him about what she did and what mediation is and what he might be looking for. And finally he said, well, even though you say you don't do transformative mediation, I want you to do this mediation anyway. And she said, oh, why? And he said, well, really, since it's my sister who needs it, I just want a mediator in a skirt. So that's my story about what mediation is useful for. And as for those of you who know me, you know that I don't like to talk and listen to myself so much. So I would love to have other people's comments and questions and find out what your reactions are to this field that we all think that we're part of.
Any questions? I've got a question. Zena, could you tell us about the shift toward collaborative law, and where is that taking us?
Oh, wonderful question, yeah. Collaborative law is, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is a movement among lawyers to try to get the skills themselves to settle cases without a mediator. And so the lawyers take an oath, not really an oath, they have the parties sign an agreement that if they go to court, they will have to get different lawyers, that what they're hiring are settlement lawyers, not litigators. And that if it turns into litigation, then other lawyers need to come in. And so these lawyers are really focusing on what skills do I need to be able to settle cases as opposed to the litigation skills that I learned. And one of the reasons that I think that collaborative law has come up is because in many places, and right now, most of the collaborative law is being done in family law. They're looking at it in employment, but most of it's being done in family law. A lot of the lawyers who were really interested in helping to settle cases were really blocked out of mediation. They were told that only the parties could come to mediation, and they wanted to be there too. They wanted to be helping out. And so this was a way for the lawyers to say, I can be a dispute resolver also. My own feeling is that it's much harder to be a collaborative lawyer than to be a mediator, because you have to represent your client as well as trying to look at the needs and interests of the opposing party and thinking of ways to settle as well. So those people who have really developed skills in it, I really take my hat off to them. I think it's a very hard thing to do. In addition to looking at their own skills, collaborative law involves bringing other professionals in to help the parties. So for example, they'll bring in child specialists who can talk to the parents about what would be best to do for their children. They bring in financial specialists to help the parties think through all of the financial issues and how to best use the finances for the best interests of both of the parties. And then they can bring in therapists, they can bring in other specialists as needed. And what that means is that for parties who can afford that, because it can get quite expensive, that they really come out with a lot of support for doing things well in divorce. So I think it started in the 90s, if I'm correct. But it really is a part of the idealism of mediation, and as it started back in the 70s and the 80s. So I think it's all part of that same ideal of let's sit down and talk, and let's see if we can't settle.
Another question I have, I'm full of questions.
Yes, it's wonderful.
What kind of support systems do neutral interveners or conflict specialists need from each other? Like what kind of ways can budding mediators, skilled mediators who are moving into a new discipline, what kind of systems are there in place?
Support systems for mediators.
Yeah, for like healing the healers or training the healers or that sort of thing.
Wow. You know, part of my response to that question is, as I look at what particularly family lawyers, but other lawyers as well, go through, we have it so easy. That the stress of our profession is so much less than the stress of the people who are the advocates. And so I have a hard time thinking through the answer to that question. So let me throw that out to other people who may have better answers than I. Oh, okay. Well, is there an answer to that question? Anybody have an answer? So what support is there for mediators? Is that your?
We need circles and practice where we get together and talk periodically as.
Yeah. Yeah, and if you're talking about increasing our skill, I absolutely agree that we need to be talking to each other, that we need to find ways of finding out what other people do. One of my favorite things to do is to watch the videos that are out there of what other mediators do and pick up techniques that I never would have thought of. I was giving an advanced training last weekend and did some kind of a technique that somebody in the audience said, boy, that is just a fabulous technique. And I said, you are so right, and here's where I stole it from. And yeah, just to be able to observe what other mediators do. And I think that's one of the things we don't get to do very much. We talk to other mediators. I think observing other mediators is the most helpful thing in terms of learning how to approach things differently. Well, which is why the videos are so wonderful. And in terms of Cyber Week and what's happening with online dispute resolution, the Hawaii folks and Giuseppe Leone have really been putting things online of mediations by Skype, where both parties and the mediator are there. And it is so helpful to watch those and to watch the techniques and to see what can be done, not just because of online dispute resolution, but just as a way to see what mediators do and the different ways that they operate. So to me, that is really exciting. And then to be able to get together and talk about it is quite wonderful.